All right, welcome everyone to the Section 504 Special Education What's the Difference webinar. Currently, everyone is muted again, so if you have a question, please use the chat box. And this webinar is being recorded. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Charlie Michel so he could start.
Thanks, Wallace, I appreciate it. And I know Wallace said that you could put your questions in the chat and someone will monitor that. And also there'll be time at the end. But if a question comes up in the middle of it, please feel free to put it in that chat and we'll answer it as it comes along. And the other thing is, as you're asking the questions, because this is being recorded, I would urge you not to put any personally identifiable information like your child's name, the school they go to, or whatever like that. That way, this recording won't have any confidential information on it. Okay? Thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And I do, like as Wallace did, I want to welcome you to our training on Section 504, Special Education. What is the difference? My name is Charlie Michel, and I'll be the presenter for this training. My co-host today, and you met him already, will be Wallace Johnson from Families Helping Families of Southwest Louisiana. And this training is going to cover some of the basic differences between Section 504 and IDEA, or special education. Now, in order to continue to receive funding to provide these free trainings, I ask that you complete an evaluation at the end. The evaluation results help us to improve trainings and demonstrate the need for continued funding to provide these types of trainings to our community free of charge. You will be prompted again at the end to complete the evaluation, and it should take you less than 2 minutes to be able to complete. It's very short. And if at any time you lose audio, just call in using the phone number that was on the email invitation that you received earlier, and you can join back in at any time. And Families Helping Families of Southwest Louisiana provides dozens of webinars and in-person trainings on special education and disability-related topics such as this every year. That's kind of what we do. All right. And I'm having a little trouble with my slides over here. Let's see. I'm having trouble. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to ask Melinda Elliott to come on and take care of this next slide for us, if you don't mind, Melinda. And it's good seeing you and talking to you again.
Sure. Nice to see you too, Dr. Michel. Thank you. So we have several state partners that I want to talk about today. One of them is the Families Helping Families Network. We're part of a network of 10 family helping family centers in Louisiana. When you get this PowerPoint, you're going to have a hot link to be able to go to the link for the center in your area if you're not in Southwest Louisiana. Then we also have F2FHIC, which assists families of children and youth ages birth through 24 with special health care needs, mental or behavioral issues, disabilities, or other medical concerns. They also have their own website, though they are located at, they're on the website for Bayou Land Families Helping Families because they're a program of Bayou Land Families Helping Families, but they're a statewide organization. And then there's another one called LACAN, which is Advocates for Inclusive Education for all students and for individual and family supports and services for Louisiana citizens that have developmental disabilities. As we speak, there are people at the Special Education Advisory Panel wearing bright yellow shirts, which I can provide, or any of the LACAN leaders can provide, because there's one of me in all 10 regions. And we are there about, although we're listening to some changes that they're proposing for one of the bulletins, we're there about restraints and seclusion. As you may know, seclusion has no research whatsoever saying that it is an effective technique with students with disabilities or without disabilities. Unfortunately, students with disabilities are secluded and restrained more often than students without disabilities. But we also want to strengthen some of the things around restraints. There was a Louisiana Legislative Auditor's report that made some very specific suggestions, like giving the Louisiana Department of Education more oversight, direct oversight. And well, the school systems already have money for cameras in the classroom, in the special ed classroom, not just any classroom. It has to be in the special ed classroom. And instead of waiting until parents request it, one of the things that we're working on, and we have a legislator that's working on it now, is for the school systems to just go ahead and put cameras in the classroom. And for specific training about restraints. And yesterday, we were at the legislature to listen to information about the budget, even though there's no cuts at this point to developmental disability services. We also know that there's an election, I believe, this weekend, where we have some amendments, and if they don't pass, we're not sure what's going to happen. So we wanted to make it known that we were concerned about possible cuts. And there's all kinds of other exciting things going on. I could go on forever about this, but I won't. If you have questions, drop them in the chat. I'm not surprised if Wallace has already dropped the link to join. It is free to join. At this point, you are agreeing to get emails. Of course, I might want you to send emails or do other things at some point, but I will give it back to you, Dr. Michel.
All righty. Can you hear me, Melinda?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just wanted to make sure I wasn't muted. All right. And Melinda, those are some really important issues, and I'm hoping that everyone that's paying attention today will be able to take some time to research it, because restraint and seclusion is a real issue in the schools. And part of the problem is that the teachers don't always have options of, that they know about. The training is insufficient. So we're hoping that that's going to be taken care of. And as you said, Melinda, all the school districts already have money for special ed cameras in the classroom. And in reviewing of some of the policies of local school districts, the process of a parent requesting those cameras can be quite convoluted and quite involved, and it shouldn't be that way. So I'm hoping that y'all are able to do what you're saying that y'all are going to do, and have a legislator introduce a bill that would require that the money be used now to get those cameras in place, because that's going to help everybody. It helps the child, it helps the parent feel better, and it helps the school system, because it is for their protection as well as anybody else's. So thanks a lot for y'all hard work, Melinda. I really do appreciate that, and I'm sure everyone else does too. These slides will not go. Let's see. I'm sorry. I'm trying to advance this slide, and it just will not let me do it for some reason.
Try clicking on the slide and then clicking to advance.
There we go. Good job, Melinda. You always come through. Thank you. I was pressing enter. All right. Very good. All right. Today, we would like to accomplish a few things with this webinar. I'm hoping that today you're going to know the differences between Section 504 and special education services, as well as the law. I'm hoping you'll have a better understanding of the overview of the process used to determine eligibility for each. And that you understand the process used to access services, because there are some differences. There are a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. And it's important that you know the differences between an IAP, or an individualized accommodation plan, which is for Section 504, and an IEP, or an individualized education plan, which is for special ed. And after we've talked for a little while, I hope you have a better understanding of how Section 504 and 1508, IDEA, special ed, that's all this, 1508, all that is all the same. How those programs can help students with disabilities who are struggling in school. And as we're talking about this, you're going to learn, hopefully, about the kinds of accommodations that can be part of an IAP and an IEP. And then at the end, you can make your own determination of whether you think which one is better than the other. All right. Now, let me see if I have a pre-check in here. Let's see. I do not. Okay. All right. So we're going to. All right. So now let's get to the meat and potatoes of today's presentation. It's important that we know the history of IDEA, and I think it's more important that we know it now than we ever have in the past, because Wallace and I were talking about this earlier. It has taken us 50 years, since 1975, 50 years to get from where children with disabilities had no rights in the school to where we are today. And while we all can agree that there are many things that need to still happen for children with disabilities in the schools, we can certainly acknowledge that we are infinitely better than we were in 1975. And the reason I say it's more important now than ever to learn it is because now there are people who are trying to take away rights and services and supports of children with disabilities. And we'll talk about that a little bit. That's more of a recent development. But in 1975, when Public Law 94-142 was passed, it was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And it was also called the EHA. And we love acronyms in special ed. So I'll try to remember to spell out what those are. If I don't say what the acronym means, please put in the chat or somebody stop me so that I can tell you what it is, because my intent is to make sure that this is informative for you. Now, Public Law 94-142 recognized and addressed the fact that more than half of the school-age children with disabilities in the United States were not receiving an education, and that those who were attending schools were often placed in settings apart from their peers who had no disabilities. Just as importantly, the educational needs of these children with disabilities were often being overlooked. Before this law was passed, and even for a little while after, children with disabilities were refused admission into the schools. And if they were allowed, they were put in, and this is literal, this is not exaggeration, custodians' closets, storerooms, any place that there was a nook and cranny that they could warehouse these children. And look, I'm the first to say it wasn't out of maliciousness. It was a bad outcome, but the intent wasn't as bad as the outcome was. But nobody knew any better. There was no one advocating for children with disabilities at the time. And that's where parents of children with disabilities came in. It was through the advocacy rights, the advocacy efforts of parents throughout the country that this law was passed in 1975. And then in 1990, Public Law 101-476 was passed. And with that, let me tell you what that is, 101-476. It was the 101st session of Congress, and it was the 476th bill passed in that Congress. Just like Public Law 94-142 was the 94th session of Congress, and it was the 142nd bill that was passed. So now, in 1990, when Public Law 101-476 was passed, it was later referred to as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, as we usually refer to it. And this law added traumatic brain injury and autism to the list of identified disabilities and emphasized that students with disabilities must have equal access to the same curriculum as their peers with no disabilities. And we'll talk a little bit more. It says we added traumatic brain injury and autism. We'll talk in a little bit about what the other ones are, the other categories. Then in 2004, 14 years later, Congress amended IDEA by calling for early intervention for students, greater accountability, and improved educational outcomes, and raised the standards for instructors who teach special education classes. It also required states to demand that local school districts shift up to 15% of their special education funds toward general education if it was determined that a disproportionate number of students from minority groups were placed in special education for reasons other than a disability. So what that means is every school district receives federal dollars under IDEA, under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And whatever that amount is, if it's, let's say it's $1 million that they get it. If they get $1 million and it's determined through auditing and monitoring that more minority students are being placed in special ed than the non-minority students, than say white students, then there is a problem if it's a substantial amount more. So what they have to do in order to address that problem is, of that $1 million, 15% or $150,000 would have to be used for activities to prevent children, especially the minority children, from being put in special education. And by that, I mean, not if they qualify, but if they, in order to keep them from qualifying, through interventions, through helping the child, giving them more specialized tutoring, all kinds of different things that they can do to support the child so that they don't need the supports of special education. So they can do up to 15%. Now, when I was a special ed director in Lafourche Parish, we always did our 15%, but we didn't always have to. It's mandated if you are considered disproportionate in your identification. But even the years that we weren't disproportionate, we believed, and I still believe, that intervention is the way to go because it helps all students, those who might qualify for special ed and those who do not. So we would do that annually, and that helped to fund some of those interventions that were in place. All right, that's a brief history of, a very brief history of special ed. Now, a brief history of Section 504. When you hear Section 504, that's the shortened version. What it is Section 504 of the Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And that's why we call it Section 504, because it's so much shorter. And this act was passed to ensure that all people have equal access to buildings and opportunities, regardless of their disabilities. Now, when it was first passed, it really was geared mostly toward access to federal buildings. But as time went on, people with disabilities and their families wondered why equal access couldn't be expanded past federal buildings. So through their advocacy work again, and through lobbying, which is what we do constantly, in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA as it is called, was passed. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination based on a person's disability. Now, in 2008, the ADA Amendments Act, and this is my favorite, or as it's called, the ADAAA. We love an acronym. It doesn't matter how ridiculous it might be. In 2008, this law was passed, and it was an act of Congress that became effective on January 1st, 2009. And it amended the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and other disability non-discrimination laws at the federal level of the United States. This act emphasizes that the definition of disability should be construed in favor of broad coverage of individuals to the maximum extent permitted by the terms of the ADA, and generally shall not require extensive analysis. That's a whole lot of gobbledygook for means that it's easier it basically boils down to the fact it's easier to become eligible for Section 504 services because the definition is much broader than it is in IDEA. And it's easier to become eligible for Section 504 services because the evaluation process is much less restrictive. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes, and we'll talk about what the advantages of that and the disadvantages of that are as well. Now, this act, the ADAAA, makes important changes to the definition of the term disability by rejecting the holdings in several Supreme Court decisions and portions of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's ADA regulations. The effect of these changes is to make it easier for an individual seeking protection under the ADA to establish that he or she has a disability within the meaning of the ADA. And this is important because it sets up one of the fundamental differences between identification of a disability under Section 504 and identification of a disability under special education. Now, let's talk about funding for special ed. And look, I'm going to say this, I think, at some point in the future, but I just want you to know 1508, which is the Louisiana State Bulletin that identifies the processes through which children can become eligible for special education services. 1508, IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and special ed students. All those are used synonymously in life. In the school system, they refer to them as 1508 students, IDEA students, special ed students, and they do that just because they're all the same thing. It's all about eligibility for those services. So I wanted to get that out the way. So when you see like 1508 and IDEA in parentheses, it's the same thing. While special education is a federal law, each state must produce guidelines and regulations to ensure that the law is passed. And that's what Bulletin 1508 is. It's the federal government requires that each state publishes rules by which they can become eligible. Bulletin 1508 is created by the State Department of Education and adopted by the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. And that is what all school districts must follow in order to determine eligibility. Now, when IDA was originally passed, it was intended to fund about 40% of the cost of local school systems to provide these services. The remainder of the cost to provide these services would be borne by the local school districts using local and state funds. Since the beginning, however, the actual funding of these services has actually never surpassed 20% and has frequently fell short of that mark. So the difference, whether the feds give 40% or 20%, whatever is needed is put up by the state and local revenues earned with the school system. However, IDA is clear in its mandate that any lack of funding cannot be used as an excuse for not providing services identified as a result of the IEP team discussions and decisions. So if a school system says they don't have the money to do something, probe deeper. If they don't have the money for an appropriate activity, that would be a violation of the law. But if they don't have money for something that goes beyond appropriate, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that would not be a violation. So the key here is anytime the school system says they don't have the money for it, then you want to ask the question, what can we do to, you want to tell them, this is the outcome that I would like. What can we do to get that? And in most instances, there's probably a different way to do it that maybe you didn't think about, but you want to make sure you don't just let, we don't have the money rest as an explanation for denial. And if they say they don't have the money and they refuse to provide the service, when you get at the end of the IEP meeting, they have to give you what's called a prior written notice. And it tells you what ideas you have discussed, what ideas you have, the school system has agreed to, what ideas they have denied, and the reasons. So you make sure in that explanation that they put that they don't have the money, because that is a killer. That is a definite killer from the school system standpoint. So don't let money be, you can have it in the discussion, but don't let money be the basis of any decision that they make. All right, so let's talk about funding of 504 services. Well, I'm going to tell you, this is going to be a much briefer discussion than the one for 1508. And the reason for that is there just isn't any funding. All costs to support Section 508 services are borne by the local school system. There are no federal or state dollars designated for this. It is all from what they call the general fund. But the lack of funding does not provide the school system with an excuse either not to provide services and supports required for a student in order for him or her to level the playing field with the peers who have no disability. So that there is no funding for Section 504, that is a huge difference between Section 504 and IDA. But both Section 504 and IDA are in agreement that lack of funding cannot limit the educational services deemed appropriate to a child with a disability through the IEP or the IAP meeting process. So even whether your child is qualifies for 504 or your child qualifies for special ed, nobody can land on the decision that we can't give this to you because we don't have any money. That is patently illegal. So keep that in mind. Because some school systems, and they know better, but some people in the school system don't know that. So you want to hold them to task because you don't want that to be the basis of your child not receiving necessary services. And let me just qualify. Necessary services, your child might be eligible for speech therapy, where you know, if you ask for 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, odds are they're not going to get it because there are specifications of what speech therapy can and cannot provide in the school setting. Anything in excess of that would go to a private setting that would be at your expense. But if they say, well, we're sorry, we don't have any speech therapists, so we can't provide any speech therapy, but your child clearly qualifies for speech therapy, That is not your problem. That is their problem. They can contract with a speech therapist. They can do whatever they have to do. They can call a neighboring district and get somebody to come and help them out, and they pay them. But that is not your problem. Your child should not have the therapy, whether it's speech, physical therapy, occupational therapy, whatever it is. So make sure that you don't let it land on we just don't have the money. All right. Now, in order to determine eligibility for special education services, an evaluation must be conducted. But before such an evaluation is able to take place, either the parent, the school, or the student must express in writing that there is a concern. Those concerns are then brought to the school building level committee, of which you are a member. It's not just school personnel, it's parent as well. All right, so we're still talking about eligibility for special ed. We talked about the school building level committee, which is also called the SBLC, because again, we love a good acronym, and it's a little quicker to say that than it is the whole thing. So the SBLC is charged with the responsibility of reviewing student data when a concern has been noted. It is the SBLC, of which you are a member, that can decide one of several things. The committee can decide to refer a student for evaluation. They can recommend that interventions be provided and the student progress is monitored, or they can just continue monitoring student performance and reconvene at a later date to discuss progress or lack of progress. Pupil Appraisal Center personnel, school psychologist, a social worker, typically is one of those, are typically in attendance at an SBLC meeting when discussing parental concerns and a parent's desire to have their child evaluated. PAC, or Pupil Appraisal Center representative, can explain the evaluation process and provide the necessary documents for you to sign in order for such an evaluation to begin. It's important to know that once the discussions of evaluation have begun, the student is protected under IDEA in the event of any disciplinary event that may take place. However, it is equally important to know that should any disciplinary event take place before the evaluation request is made, the student will enjoy no such protections. Once the evaluation is complete, the school building level committee will reconvene with the parent to discuss the findings. It is during this meeting that the eligibility determination is made. If the student is determined to be eligible for services under the IDEA, an initial IEP meeting would be scheduled to discuss which supports and services would be appropriate for your child in order to address the concerns you stated upon your request for the evaluation. Now, following this initial IEP meeting, at least one IEP meeting must be conducted annually to review your child's progress and to make necessary changes based on the data presented during those meetings. However, either the school personnel or the parents have a right to call for an IEP meeting anytime it is felt that a free appropriate public education, or FAPE, yes, another acronym, is not being provided. And we'll talk about what FAPE is in a little bit. If it's not being provided, or if the student's progress indicates a need for changes, or the supports or services on the IEP, or that the terms of the IEP aren't being implemented. So if the child's not making progress, if the IEP is not being implemented, if any of those things, if you have any concerns about any of those things, or if the school has any concerns about any of those things, anyone can call an IEP meeting at any time. So, and I say this because I find it, when I was working for Bioland Families Helping Families, it was amazing to me as a former special ed director, how many parents were being told that they could only have one IEP meeting a year. That is absolutely not true. And it's written in the law that that is not accurate. All right. So now let me talk a little bit about the discipline issue that we talked about. Once you request an evaluation for your child then needs to be treated as a special education student in terms of dealing with any disciplinary infraction that takes place. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean you get special treatment. It means that there are elements of due process that come into play that must be followed because your child is now suspected of having a disability. So if you make the request this morning and your child gets, let's say, in a fight this afternoon, well, then the school system has to have what's called a manifestation determination meeting, and they will talk about your child's suspected disability. And remember, the child hadn't been determined to have a disability, but the child is suspected of having one. So they'll talk about that, and they'll talk about how that disability might have impacted his involvement in that fight. Does he have impulsive behavior? Did somebody pick on him, bully him, tease him, and his impulsive behavior came through and he just swung. They have to look at all those things to see if in fact the behavior that is against school rules was in violation, was manifest. No, I don't want to use that word again. Was because of the disability. So they have to do that. And if it was because of his disability, they cannot discipline him. They cannot suspend him. They cannot expel him. They can certainly do things to help support him, but they cannot give him a disciplinary consequence. They can do things instructionally to help him make sure he's supported, but they cannot discipline. However, let's say the same thing happens. The only difference is the fight is this morning and you make a request for special ed this afternoon. Even if you thought about it before, like you thought about, a couple of days ago, you said, there's something not quite right with the way he's processing this, or my child is processing this. Well, if the fight happens this morning and you ask for that evaluation this afternoon, you're still entitled to an evaluation for your child, but the child will be treated as any other regular general education student. So even if they think that they don't have to have a manifestation determination meeting, but even if they think it's related to the suspected disability, he can be disciplined like anyone else. So it's very important to know the sequence. You ask for the evaluation and then an infraction happens, he gets due process more so than a general education student. He has an infraction of discipline, and then you ask for the evaluation, he gets what everybody else gets. Okay. All right. So we talked a little bit about FAPE just now, because one of the reasons that you can call an IEP meeting is if you don't think that FAPE is being provided. FAPE means free appropriate public education. Now, to be appropriate, education programs for students with disabilities must be designed to meet their individual needs to the same extent that the needs of non-disabled students are met. And appropriate education may include regular or special education services and related aids and services to accommodate the unique needs of the individuals with the disabilities. One way to ensure that programs meet individual needs is through the development of an individualized education program, or an IEP, or a Section 504 plan for each student with a disability. IEPs are required for students participating in the special education programs of recipients of funding under the IDEA. Section 504 plans, or IAPs, are required for students who meet the definition of disabled through the Section 504 laws and regulations. These 504 plans are also referred to, as we said earlier, as Individual Accommodations Plan, or an IAP. The quality of education services provided to students with disabilities must equal the quality of services provided to non-disabled students. Teachers of students with disabilities must be trained in the instruction of individuals with disabilities. Facilities must be comparable, and appropriate materials and equipment must be available equal to the availability to other students who don't have disabilities. Students with disabilities may not be excluded from participating in non-academic services and extracurricular activities on the basis of disability. Persons with disabilities must be provided an opportunity to participate in non-academic services that is equal to those provided to persons without disabilities. These services may include physical education and recreational athletics, transportation, health services, recreational activities, special interest groups or clubs sponsored by the school, field trips, and referrals to agencies that provide assistance to persons with disabilities and employment of students. Another issue that I've seen in the past is schools having a field trip, fourth grade's having a field trip. Well, all of a sudden you get a call and they say, you have to drive your child on the field trip because we don't have a bus. Like, your child might be in a wheelchair. We don't have a bus. That actually happened to me numerous times when my children were little. So the reality of it, you can if you want to, but you do not have to. They cannot make it a requirement because it's equal access. So if they provide transportation for all students, they have to provide it for all students, including your child. Doesn't matter that it costs them more to get an extra bus, because the reality of their options, you can get a large bus, a long bus with a lift on it, and everybody can go on the same bus. It doesn't have to cost them more. They just have to be creative with how they do this. If you decide that you're going to do it, then they're required to offer you, and you can ask for it if they don't offer, reimbursement for mileage. Absolutely can do that. And there's a pot of money under the IDEA funds that would allow them to do that legally. and it's not a big deal, but you don't have to drive them. The other thing that's a little more dicey, I guess, if you will, if your child has significant behavior problems, and it doesn't matter if they have a classification of autism or other health impaired or emotionally disturbed, doesn't matter what the classification is. If they have significant behavior problems and the school tells you, we cannot allow your child to go on the field trip, you need to ask, why is that? Because the reality of it is, if it is because your child to be at that particular field trip, whatever it is, puts him at risk physically, or he, because of his behaviors, put other students at risk physically, talk about that with the school system and come up with ideas. But it is they can't, if they say he can come, but you have to come with him. No, you don't. You certainly can. But they're charged with the responsibility of monitoring your child just as they are with everybody else. If that means they have to bring one extra person or two extra people trained to work with your child, they need to do that. And as we said earlier, if they say we don't have the money, or another statement which says the same thing, we don't have the staff, too bad. They are required to do it. And when they say we don't have enough paras to do it and still meet the needs of the school, here's one that always kills them. A counselor can go, a principal can go, assistant principal can go, any number of ways. They just have to have trained personnel to go. So keep that in mind. You can take no for an answer, but don't take it, you don't have to take it immediately. And if they give you some ideas that make it make sense, then fine, work with them. But don't let them bamboozle you into thinking that they don't have money or resources and that's the only reason your child can't go, because that is purely not legal. All right, let's talk about defining disability under 1508 or IDEA. Remember, we talked about in 1990, the law was passed and it added autism and traumatic brain injury to the law as it was prior to that. Well, this is where we're going to talk about what those other categories are. And this discussion, because now it is included, will include TBI or traumatic brain injury and autism. IDA very clearly identifies 13 specific physical or mental impairments which constitute a disability should any of those impairments substantially limit access to the student's educational opportunities. But in addition to the presence of a disability, in order for a student to be determined eligible for special education services under the IDEA, the evaluation must also conclude that in order to have equal access to educational opportunities and the general education curriculum as their peers who don't have a disability, specialized instruction and or support services are required. In the absence of the need for specialized instruction and or support services, the student cannot be determined eligible for special education classification under the IDEA. So what that means is that's why we have children that have medical diagnosis of autism, and they might even have an educational diagnosis of autism, but they're functioning so well, they don't need any supports in the school. That means they're doing well academically, they're doing well behaviorally, they're doing well socially. There's no need for supports to help them level the playing field. The playing field is already leveled. If that's the case, even though they do have autism, they will not be eligible for special education services. Now, this eligibility we're talking about in many states can be determined regarding concerns in children between the ages of 3 and 21 years of age. In Louisiana, we have the Early Steps program, which provides intervention to eligible students from birth until the age of 3. Upon the child reaching third birthday, if eligibility continues, the local school system begins to provide these supports and services. Here are the 13 disabilities identified in IDEA: autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, including and this usually will include ADHD. ADHD is not a disability in and of itself under IDEA, but it is typically included with other health impairment. Specific learning disability, a speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury that was added in 1990, visual impairment, including blindness. Now, there's a 14th disability category that is allowed if school districts choose to use it. If a child is experiencing developmental delays at a young age, as defined by the state and as measured by appropriate diagnostic instruments and procedures, in one or more of the following areas: physical development, cognitive development, communication development, social or emotional development, or adaptive development. And the same child who, because of those delays, needs special education and related services, the child may be determined eligible for special education services with the classification of developmental delay. They don't meet the criteria for any of these that you see on your screen right now. But if they have delays in any of those areas we talked about just a second ago, they can, and they meet the requirements of Bulletin 1508, which is the state bulletin for eligibility determination, then they can be classified as developmental delay. Now, it's crucial to understand that when the child turns 9 years old, if he or she still doesn't meet the criteria of one of these 13 recognized disabilities listed right here on your screen, the child will no longer be eligible for special education supports and services. Additionally, there's much research that supports that developmental delay might be a category that identifies poverty more than it does a disability. So it's for this reason that some school districts choose not to use this category in their identification process. And if a child at the age of 3 is reevaluated, because that they have to be reevaluated before their 3rd birthday, once they're evaluated, if they don't meet any of these 13, the criteria for any of these 13 disabilities, they might be, if they meet certain criteria, be eligible for developmental delay, as we said. But here's the caution that I put on you. If the child, when the child turns 9, they can no longer be eligible under developmental delay. They must be eligible under one of these. Now, I myself saw a child who at 3 years old was determined to have a developmental delay. And when the child turned 9 and they were evaluated, there was no developmental delay, wasn't an option because the child is 9 years old. And he didn't meet any of these 13 criteria. What happened at that point was the child is no longer eligible for special education. So the amount of support went down substantially. I mean, you can do certain things with all students, but you can't do specialized instruction. You can't do all these other things that they need. And because they no longer were eligible for any of that, that poor child at 9 years old had never known school without those supports. He was traumatized. It took a long time for us to get him to where he wasn't, I mean, literally, when he'd get a test, he would throw up. Literally. That is a literal example of what this poor child did. So what I want to caution you on is if your child does get a classification of developmental delay, make sure that that the school system, with the best of intentions maybe, is not doing more than what he needs. Because if he doesn't qualify when he turns 9 years old, there will be no supports. And then you've got this poor child with post-traumatic stress disorder, basically, because it was created in him. So be careful with the developmental delay thing. All right. So after your child is evaluated, what happens if you disagree with the findings of the evaluation team for any reason? Well, it doesn't happen often, but what is your recourse when it does happen? Federal law for special ed evaluations provides parents the right to request an independent education evaluation, or an IE, you might hear it called, free of charge anytime you disagree with the school district's evaluation. A request is all that's necessary. You do not have to provide a reason. However, I always encourage parents to explain your reason or reasons to the school system, because there might be a simple explanation that will help you better understand the findings. But as I've said, you don't have to provide such a reason or engage in such a discussion if that's your preference. Once you make the request, the school system will give you some options as to who might be able to conduct this evaluation for you. While you're entitled to this evaluation free of charge, the school district also has the right to set reasonable limits to the costs incurred. The school district's limits should be provided to you in writing at the same time that they give you the list of evaluation agencies. So if you want to engage an evaluation agency other than the ones on the list provided, you certainly may do so. But costs which surpass those allowed by the school district may have to be borne by you. And a lot of times what they do, what school districts do, is they have a collaborative effect. So like if you're in Calcasieu Parish and you request an independent education evaluation, they might get on the list. It might include, let's say, Lafayette Parish School District, or it might include Cameron School District. It might include other school districts, and frequently it does, because they do like a barter system. You know, you do evaluations for us, we do evaluations for you. And typically it's very much on the up and up. But let's say you don't want to do it because you don't trust the school system. And I'm not advocating that you shouldn't trust it, but let's say there's whatever reason you don't want to do one of the school systems and they don't have any agencies on there. Well, you can find an agency. They can help you with that, but you can find one. But you need to make sure you know a few things. One is, how much will this evaluation cost, and how much will the school system pay? And the other thing is, the agency that you select, is it familiar with the Bulletin 1508 requirements for an evaluation to determine eligibility? Because if they are not eligible, if they're not familiar with that and they do not follow that protocol, then the school system does not have to pay a penny for it. You'll still be on the hook for it, but they don't have to pay for it. So it's important that you know those things before you actually do it. Now, once the evaluation, your independent evaluation is complete, an IEP team meeting must be convened in which the school system is obligated by law to consider the findings and content of the IEE, Independent Education Evaluation. But there is no legal mandate that the school system accept the findings and or recommendations of the IEE. So all that means is you get an independent education evaluation. That is your right. But the school system is not required to accept the findings. They could, because the way it can go with at the IEP meeting, the school system could agree to all of it. They could reject all of it, or they can say, well, okay, we like this. You know, they might change your child's classification if that's appropriate. They might not, but they might like some of the recommendations. So we'll do this recommendation. So that they are obligated to consider the entire evaluation. They are not obligated to accept any of it. So keep that in mind. That way you're not disappointed at the outcome. Okay. That was the eligibility process for special education. So now let's talk about the eligibility process and the requirements of Section 504. The role of the SBLC is the same when Section 504 eligibility is being considered as it is when IDEA eligibility is being considered. The committee discusses the concerns and reviews the data to decide if evaluation is warranted, or if intervention should be implemented, or if a wait-and-see approach is in order. But remember, even if the SBLC doesn't think an evaluation is warranted at this time, by virtue of your request, they must conduct an evaluation unless you decide to hold off on your request. The SBLC nor any person in the school or district can override your right to an evaluation. I'm sorry, I'm at home. Once you have put your request in writing. Excuse me. Oh, I'm so sorry. One of the disadvantages of Zoom. Don't let anyone on the team, whether it's the SBLC chair, whether it's the principal, whether it's the special ed, the general ed teacher, the PAC person, don't let them convince you that they have to all agree in order for you to get this. That is not accurate. Y'all need to discuss what the best course of action is. And like, as we've talked about before, that could be just saying, let's send them for an evaluation. Or it could be, let's try these things and monitor them and come back and revisit it so that we can see if an evaluation is the best thing. Or it could be, let's just keep what we're doing now constant. We'll monitor it a little closer, and in a specific period of time, we'll come back and revisit the child's progress. All of those things would be perfectly appropriate, different ones for different children. So don't let them say you can't have it, because by law, you make the request, you can have it. All right. Now, if a Section 504 evaluation is being considered, there may not always be a PAC representative present. Remember, we said PAC was like the psychologist or social worker from the Pupil Appraisal Center. However, if there is one, their function would be the same: to explain the evaluation process and obtain your consent. However, if no PAC representative is in the meeting, these responsibilities typically will fall on the SBLC chair. Just like a student who's being considered for special education evaluation, once the discussions of evaluation have begun, the student is protected under Section 504 in the event of any disciplinary event that may take place. And remember, we talked about that with special ed. It's the same thing. a new level of due process comes into play once the evaluation has been requested. But remember, as we said earlier, it's equally important to note, just as is the case with IDA, should any disciplinary event take place before the evaluation request was made, the student does not enjoy any of those protections. Now, unlike IDA, Section 504 eligibility has no age limits. Because remember, we talked for special ed, it's birth to 22. But we're just discussing children in pre-K to 12 now. So we're still talking about kids, students from ages 3 to 22. So that's in the educational setting. But in real life, 504 applies to everyone. That's why if you're in a wheelchair, they have ramps, because it doesn't matter if you're 22 or 122. Your wheelchair needs to be able to access buildings, which is how it started, needs to be able to get into so that you can obtain the services that you need. Now, after this initial IAP meeting is conducted, that's once the evaluation is complete, review meetings should be conducted at least annually, but may be called anytime by the school or the parent if there is a concern that the student's progress is insufficient, and changes must be warranted, may be warranted, or if there's a concern that the plan isn't being implemented properly. Now, that may sound familiar to you because it's the same thing as special ed. You're not limited to one a year. You are mandated to have at least one a year. Okay, this is a little bit more, we're going to talk about the eligibility determination process under Section 504. And we'll get a little comparison going after this. Before a student can be determined eligible, someone has to indicate that the child has a problem. Now, that someone can be the child's parent, a school official, or the child, him or herself. In order to document this, the question often arises, does the parent request have to be in writing? Well, the technical answer is, it depends. Yes, it does have to be in writing. But what if the parent can't write? Does that mean that the student loses his ability to be considered for 504 eligibility? Absolutely not. Excuse me. If for any reason the parent can't put the request in writing, then the school personnel need to be creative. School personnel can write the request and have the parent sign it, or the school personnel can make the request and have the parent sign it. But there are many ways to get around this situation. So if there is no way to get around the fact that the parent must sign the form, the parent must sign, there's no way to get around that. But if they can't write, there are different things that you can do. And one of the things is let the parent make their mark and have two people witness it. That is a legal way to show that the parent has agreed to the evaluation. If the parent refuses to sign it, not that they're not able to, but whether they're able to or not, if they choose not to sign the request for an evaluation, then the school cannot initiate any evaluation processes. Without parental consent, no evaluation can be made. Now, once written permission is provided, the school district has 60 school days in which to complete the evaluation. Now, we're going to talk about 60 school days here. Sounds like that's not a real long time. Sounds like 2 months. Well, it's not. School days are days that school is actually open for children. So when you're talking about you get a request in October, middle of October, well, it's okay, 60 days, you figure middle of December. No, not so much, because you've got spring break, fall break, you've got Thanksgiving, and then you're going to still have Christmas before that 60 days is up. So it might be late January, early February before that evaluation is done. So if you want an evaluation done before the end of a school year, it is best to make the request sometime in January, because you've got spring break, you've got Easter break, which often are not the same in some school districts. You've got Mardi Gras. In our area, it's Mardi Gras. I don't know if y'all are close for Mardi Gras or not, but you want to make sure that you take into account all holidays, all school closures. And if we have a snow day, who thought that would be a real thing? But if you have a snow day or 2 or 3 or 4, those don't count as school days because the school was not open. So keep in mind that they have 60 school days. Now, unlike special education, which has a very specific definition of what constitutes a disability, the regulations for Section 504 eligibility are much broader, and we'll see that in a second. Now, in order to determine eligibility for services under Section 504, 3 questions must be answered. The first question is, does the student have a physical or mental impairment? And if so, describe the impairment. The second question is, does the physical or mental impairment affect one or more major life activities? We'll talk about major life activities in a minute. If so, which major life activities are affected? And the third and final question is, does the physical or mental impairment substantially limit a major life activity? And we'll talk about the definition of substantial in just a minute. Right. Now, the definition of a disability under Section 504 is very different from the definition under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Under Section 504, a person with a disability is one who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. We'll discuss those definitions later on in this presentation. Another criteria for the determination as to whether or not a person has disability under Section 504 is that the individual has a record of such an impairment, or finally, that the person is regarded as having such an impairment. Now, I have to tell you, and when I say I had a hard time wrapping my brain around regarded as having an impairment, I really did. I struggled with that for years. But after much research and many discussions with attorneys who are knowledgeable of special ed, I learned that this criterion is not so much for initial eligibility determination as it is about the anti-discrimination component of Section 504. Whether an individual is or is not determined to have a disability under Section 504, if another person takes action against that individual, such as bullying, physical aggression, etc., and that negative action is because the aggressor thinks the individual has a disability, then the aggressor can be found guilty of discrimination. Now, the key to eligibility rests within the answers to the three questions we just identified. In order to be identified as eligible for Section 504 services, the answer to all three questions must be yes. If any one of them is answered no, whether it's the first one, the second one, or the third one, then that child does not meet the eligibility requirements for a person with a disability under Section 504. So remember, the first question is, does the student have a physical or mental impairment? And if so, describe that impairment. This one is fairly easy. Any diagnosis from a doctor, data from assessments administered, interviews with family members and school staff can all be used to answer this question. This is pretty much a simple yes or no question, but it does require data to support whichever answer is determined. The second question is, does the physical or mental impairment affect one or more major life activities? This question is also fairly straightforward. If the impairment is determined to exist, does it affect one or more major life activities? And if so, which major life activities are affected? But this question leads us to another question. What are the major life activities? Section 504 doesn't list disabilities per se. Like, remember, there were 13 categories, classifications under IDEA, with the fourth one being developmentally delayed. This 504 does not list them that way, but it does provide a rather lengthy list of major life activities that, if significantly impacted, might constitute a disability. On the screen, you'll see some of the major life activities identified in Section 504, as well as in subsequent laws passed in order to strengthen the original intent of Section 504. Those laws, remember, include the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act and the 2008 Americans with Disabilities Act Amendment Act. In each of these laws, it is clearly stated that this list is not all-inclusive. Some other major life activities might include disorders of the reproductive system, the immune system, the digestive, bowel, and bladder systems, neurological systems, brain, respiratory, and circulatory functions. And even with this extensive addition to the list, it is still not all-inclusive. It's this long list, coupled with the more relaxed approach to eligibility determination stated in Section 504 law, that makes it much simpler for a person to be eligible for Section 504 services than for services under IDEA. Remember, we talked about, that was what we talked about at the very beginning. The scope of disabilities is much greater under Section 504 than it is in IDEA. So there are more ways that you can become eligible. So it makes it easier to be eligible under Section 504 than in special ed. And the other thing is the evaluation process for Section 504 eligibility cannot be as rigorous as it is for IDEA eligibility, because IDEA eligibility is very structured, and the 504 eligibility process, not so much. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. And the third and final eligibility question is, does the physical or mental impairment substantially limit a major life activity? And if so, which major life activity? Okay, so what exactly is a major life activity? Well, what's a substantial limitation? Well, that depends. And there you go. I mean, I'm going to tell you, I'm not a lawyer, but a lot of these answers are depends, which sounds like a lawyer's answering the question. But the reality of it is there's no definition provided in the law, nor in the regulations, nor in the guidance regarding Section 504. The Section 504 committee, of which you're a member, using the evaluation data, must determine whether or not there is a substantial limitation. Some of these determinations are quite clear. For example, if a child is in a wheelchair, his or her mobility is most definitely substantially limited. But what if a child has a seizure disorder but hasn't had a seizure for 2 years? Is there a substantial limitation? That answer must be individualized to the child being discussed, and the answer may very well vary from one student to another. Now, if the parent disagrees with the decision of the 504 committee, the parent has the right to follow the due process procedures that each district must have outlined for Section 504. It should be noted that the courts have not to date defined substantial limitation, and in the end, it will probably be a court that will create some sort of definition. Until that happens, it will more than likely be inconsistently interpreted across the United States. Now, as I said earlier, in order for a child to meet the definition of a person with a disability based on Section 504 regulations, the answer to each of these questions that we've talked about, the 3 questions, must be yes. Even one no answer, and the determination must be made that the child is not eligible for 504 services, regardless of which of the 3 questions was answered no. Unlike special education, what happens if you disagree with the results of your child's 504 evaluation rather? Unlike special education, Section 504 does not provide for a free independent education evaluation. Of course, you can certainly have a private evaluation done, but it will be at your own expense. If you choose to do that, the school district must again consider that evaluation, but again, they are under no obligation to accept its findings or recommendations. All right, so let's talk about the IEP team members. Remember, IEP is for special ed. There are many IEP members who are required to attend. The first is the administrator or his or her designee. This person is responsible to ensure that the supports and services provided for in the IEP will be available, and that lack of funding is not used as an excuse to not provide them. I'm going to caution you, that's their role. It appears that some administrators don't recognize that, and they're the ones that use lack of funding as a reason not to provide the services. So keep in mind, the administrator there is knowledgeable of the services available in the school system, and they will be responsible for making it happen for any appropriate services, supports needed for the child based on the IEP team decisions. So this person is responsible to ensure that the supports and services provided for in the IEP is available. Now, the general education teacher is one who should be familiar with your child and who has knowledge of the grade level curriculum your child will be expected to learn. Sometimes it's impossible to have your own child. Like, for example, if you're at the end of 5th grade and you're going into 6th grade, the child's going into 6th grade, they may not know who your child's 6th grade teacher is going to be. The 5th grade teacher might not be familiar with the 6th grade curriculum. There's all kinds of things. So they need to have somebody who knows your child, preferably knows your child, and knows the curriculum of the grade that y'all are going to be discussing. But at least the curriculum, they must know the curriculum. Now then we have the special ed teacher. Now remember, your child is special ed, but you still need that general ed teacher. Your special ed teacher will be able to explain how the lessons in the general education classroom that will be discussed by the general ed teacher will be accommodated, and how those accommodations will be documented and reported to you. Now, the parent must be invited. They can't have IEP meetings under normal circumstances without the parent. but they can have it in some instances without the parent, but only if it can only be done if it's accompanied by repeated documented attempts on the part of the school to schedule a meeting at a time that works for all parties involved. Repeated no-shows to an agreed upon scheduled meeting or failure to respond to requests to schedule a meeting are all good reasons for the IEP meeting to proceed without the parent. But if the school waits too long to begin the scheduling process and the IEP will go out of timelines, if you can't make it at the only time they are offering, that is not sufficient reason to proceed without the parent. They need to go out of timeline. The student can attend if the parent so desires, but if the student has turned 18, all rights have been transferred to that student, and then the parent can only attend if the adult student agrees. So remember, at 18, your child becomes the master of his own domain. You can come if they allow you to come. Now, other people might be present as well. Related services personnel like occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy, counseling, or nursing services may also be determined necessary based on your child's individual needs. If that's the case, then these support personnel should also be in attendance. Now, others may attend the IEP at the request of the parent or the school. Any additional people present should know the child and be able to contribute to the discussion. This could include family members, advocates, or attorneys. If the parent wants to bring an advocate or an attorney, it would be appropriate to inform the school at the time the meeting is scheduled. Usually when a parent brings an attorney, the school will want to have their attorney present as well. So informing the school in advance will often save you the inconvenience of showing up with an attorney and then the school having to reschedule the meeting so that their attorney can attend. If you want to bring an advocate, you don't have to notify the school in advance, but doing so will often make the meeting less contentious. If you want to bring a family friend or relative or anyone else for moral support, there is no need to inform the school, although you certainly may if you choose. And look, when you look at this list, you've got an administrator, one general ed teacher, one special ed teacher, one parent, and then you might have 3 or 4 related service personnel members. And if it's an evaluation discussion, you might have 1 or 2 evaluation team members. All of that and one lone parent. So if you want to bring an advocate, that's fine. If you want to bring an attorney, that's fine. But if you want to just bring somebody, might be your sister, might be your brother, might be your child's godparent, somebody who can give you moral support where you won't feel as overwhelmed in that meeting. Because while it is not the strategy of the school system in most instances to intimidate you, the very nature of an IEP meeting can be very intimidating when you've got 6 to 8 to 10 professionals sitting across the table from you and you're by yourself. And while the school system in many instances may know more about the law than you do, the reality is they often don't. So if you can get somebody that can help you with that part of it as well, make sure that y'all are on an even playing field, because the outcome is everybody wants the same outcome. They want what's right for the child. So just make sure that you're comfortable enough to participate. And if you need supports for that, then call your advocate, get a relative or a family member, anybody to go with you so that you can feel like you are able to participate. And again, while you don't have to inform the school of everyone you might be bringing with you, the school must inform you of all their representatives prior to the day of the meeting. And one of the reasons, there's a couple of reasons why I suggest that you let the school know. One is I think it builds good, strong relationships because then everything's transparent and it doesn't look like anybody's trying to get you. But the other reason, much more down to earth, is if you're going to bring several people with you, which is certainly you're right, and it's fine to do it, it would be good for the school to know so they can make sure they have a room big enough set up for all the people that are going to be in the meeting. So that it's just a practical kind of thing. All right. Now let's talk about the role of the IEP team. The IEP team is responsible to collect and review data, current data, related to the concerns of the parent and or school. These concerns might involve academics, behavior, medical, or other areas. The person in charge of the IEP team, usually but not always the special ed teacher, then coordinates a date and time that is appropriate for all team members to meet in order to discuss the data. It is during the IEP meeting that these data are reviewed and discussed as they pertain to the student's disability, as well as the progress the student is making or is not making. If insufficient progress is being made, then the team should consider changing some of the goals and objectives and/or accommodations and supports being provided. Based on the discussions of progress, the IEP team should indicate when they will next meet to review progress again. Now, note, it doesn't have to be a specific date. The committee can set up a time frame. We're going to meet in 9 weeks. We're going to meet in 6 weeks. We're going to meet in 3 months to review the child's progress. But you want to make sure that that discussion is there. So it may be open-ended as to the specific date, but it is not open-ended to make the school system believe that you have to wait till the end of the IEP year to be able to meet with them. That is not the case. The longer you wait to have an IEP meeting when your child is not making progress, the harder it is for that child to catch up. So if you go 3 months before you have a meeting and the child's not making progress right now, and you make some changes and you go 3 months before you have another meeting, well, if the child continues to not make progress, that's that much more gap that has to be filled. So you want to, you don't want to make it in 2 weeks because that's not long enough to collect data. But certainly I think 6 weeks is very sufficient. You might be able to do 4.5 weeks, like the next progress report, that kind of thing. So just gauge it based on your child's individual needs. All right. The decisions made during the IEP meetings are how the IEP team is defining FAPE, or free appropriate public education, for the student. During these discussions, it's important to remember that FAPE stands for free appropriate public education, not free optimal public education. So some of the things that are discussed may be great, but they may exceed the scope of appropriate. If that's the case, remember the school is legally obligated to provide appropriate, not optimal. For example, it might be appropriate for your child to have some pull-out time where they go into a resource room, if you will, to get a little bit more specialized instruction. It may be, or it may be appropriate that the child have a special ed teacher go into the general ed classroom to provide supports. Those things might be appropriate based on your child's needs. But let's say you want to, you really like this one teacher, and so you want to put in the IEP that Miss Smith is going to be Johnny's teacher. Well, that's not appropriate. That's not, the IEP does not cover specific personnel that provides supports and services. You might want, you think Johnny's socialization skills are not good, so you might want him to undergo swimming with the dolphins at summer camp so that he can get more socialization. Well, typically that's not appropriate. But if the school says no right off the bat, they have to at least consider it. So what you want to do is, if you want swimming with the dolphins or anything else, tell them what you want to accomplish it. And then the discussion then go, wow, that may not be appropriate. Let's see if we can do these things to get that same outcome in a different way. So remember, it's appropriate, not optimal. All right. Remember, one of the differences between special education eligibility and Section 504 eligibility is that in Section 504, if the answer to all 3 of those questions is yes, the student has a disability as defined by Section 504, and that disability substantially limits one or more major life functions, then that student is determined to have a disability and is eligible for services. But remember, with special education, IDEA requires that the evaluation go one step farther. Once it is determined that a child has a disability, in order to be eligible to receive special education services, he or she must also demonstrate a need for specialized instruction in order that he or she is able to have equal access to the general education curriculum as their peers with no disability. If there is no need for specialized instruction, there is no eligibility for special education. Now, the role of the SPLC for Section 504 team, because different schools will call it different things, is pretty much the same as the role of the IEP team. The required members are the same, as are their functions. The same rules and suggestions apply for a Section 504 meeting as they do for an IEP meeting. The purpose is to discuss current data and make decisions. You must be informed of the people present representing the school, and you should inform the school of those you will bring with you, but you are not required to do so. Now, the SPLC, once the student is determined eligible, has the same purpose and functions about the same as the IEP team for students receiving special ed services. So when your child is eligible for 504, it might be called the 504 team that's meeting. It might be considered the SBLC team that's meeting, but it has the same function as the IEP team that is meeting for children with disabilities under IDEA. Now, remember, just because your child is receiving services due to eligibility under Section 504 regulations, that doesn't mean that the team doesn't need to go through all of the steps. They should have current data available, take the time to discuss those data, obtain your feedback and concerns, and make decisions. If you are told that there are only 10 to 15 minutes for this meeting, you may either ask them to reschedule on another day for a longer period of time, or take the time you are given. And when you are out of time, tell them you want to continue the meeting and set the date before you leave. If you're not given enough time to discuss your concerns or review the data thoroughly, then your right to meaningfully participate is being violated. And meaningful participation is in both laws, 504 and special ed. So a lot of times, like we said, 504 is not funded. It's strictly the responsibility of the school system. So they typically don't hire people just for 504. So what that means is they might try to schedule 15-minute 504 meetings. Every 15 minutes they have a 504 meeting. Well, you cannot discuss 504. If they come in and it's a 504 meal where they say, here's the paperwork, sign it, and then you go about your merry business, that is not a 504 meeting. There must be discussion of data. There must be discussion of progress. There must be discussion of needs in the future. There must be those conversations, and you simply cannot do that in 20 minutes. So if they give you 15, 20-minute meeting time, tell them you want more time. Tell them you want 45 minutes. And 45 minutes is a reasonable amount of time because it's the teacher's planning period usually will coincide with that. But if at the end of the 45 minutes, you still haven't discussed everything that you want to discuss before you leave, set a date and time for another meeting. And it should not be 3 weeks in the future. If you have concerns now, they should do that at the next available slot that they have that meets your needs. So unlike the end of the IEP meeting, if you're looking at progress, you might want to say we're going to meet in 3 weeks, 6 weeks, 9 weeks, and you don't set an actual date. You want to set a date for this, unless the decision is, well, okay, we're going to monitor his progress some more. Well, then you might say we're going to meet in 3 weeks. But if you're not finished discussing your concerns, set a date and time. Don't let it grow. Don't let grass grow under your feet or theirs. All right. Now, as this discussion about accommodations take place, data should be present during the meeting in order to support whatever decisions are made by either the IEP or Section 504 IAP teams. This prevents the discussions from centering on what the school wants to provide, what the school is able to provide, or what the parents wants provided. There must be data to justify each decision regarding accommodations because all decisions center on the student. It's not what any of the adults want. It's what the student needs. And it's very important that that be kept in mind at all times. And there need to be data for any decision that's made, the decision to provide the accommodation or the decision not to provide it. So you want to be very careful that it's all limited to the student needs, and we don't get into all this other stuff, because if the principal says, well, we will do this, and the parent says, no, we won't, well, now it becomes an argument among the adults. If the principal says the student needs this, then the parent certainly can say, okay, or explain that to me, or no, I don't think he does, and this is why I don't think he does. But now the discussion is not an argument among adults. It becomes a discussion centered on the student. So it's very important to keep that in mind. It makes it a lot less stressful for everybody involved. For example, let's say we do the data could be any number of things, but let's say a student is reading 3 grade levels below his expected reading level, like a 6th grader student reading at the 3rd grade level. Well, he might well qualify for test read aloud, whereas a student who is reading on or near grade level would probably not qualify for this accommodation. A lot of people think, well, you know, if my child gets his test read aloud, he'll do better on the LEAP test. Well, okay, that might be true, but he doesn't need it based on his disability. If my child had a calculator in math, he might do better on the LEAP test. Well, that may be true, but if he doesn't have calculations disability, then he doesn't qualify for that. So there have to be data to support any decision about accommodations. And all parties need to recognize the harm that can be done to a student who is not receiving the needed accommodations, as well as the harm that can come to a student who's receiving more accommodations than needed. For example, you wouldn't provide a wheelchair for an ambulatory student with a learning disability any more than you would provide a calculator to a student who has no math computation deficits. Make the accommodations match the student's needs. Now, while IDA eligibility is in part determined by the student's needs for specialized instruction, remember that Section 504 has no such eligibility requirements. Therefore, it is very possible that a student may meet Section 504 eligibility requirements and an IAP is written which has no accommodations at all listed on it. So you might ask, so then what's the point of the 504 plan? Well, the answer is really quite simple. First of all, as a student who meets the definition of a student with a disability under Section 504 regulations, your child will enjoy the protection of Section 504 when it comes to disciplinary infractions. And we've already talked about that, the due process. Additionally, should the identified student begin to create problems, the identified disability begin to create problems for your child, he or she is already eligible for 504 services, so it would only take a 504 meeting to add needed accommodations based on the new needs. This can prevent a critical loss of time between the identification of the need and the school's ability to address it. So let's say your child is eligible for 504 because he has ADHD. He wasn't eligible for special ed under IDEA, but he's eligible for 504 because of ADHD, but he's taking medication. So really there've been no problems. Behaviorally, he's fine. Socially, she's fine. Whatever the deal is, it's working out well. All of a sudden, the medication isn't working. You can't afford the medication. The child is refusing to take medication and is hiding it from you. Any of those things where medication is no longer working for whatever reason. Well, behaviorally and socially, there might be some implications to that. Well, if you notice that, then the 504 team can meet and come up with some accommodations very quickly to address those mitigating factors. They won't buy the medicine for your child, but they can help with some of the impulse control, help him with impulse control, help him with different decision-making strategies, whatever the child needs. So keep in mind, that's why you want to have that open IAP. Until he needs it, there may be no accommodations, but when he needs it, you're not wasting any time. Now, we've already discussed accommodations are determined based on student needs and data to support those needs. However, not all accommodations can be made available to all students. We've already discussed how the accommodations need to match the needs of the student and should be geared toward leveling the playing field so that your child will have an equal opportunity to access the general education curriculum and school programs as his or her peers that don't have disabilities. But there are some accommodations that can't be provided. That list would include any accommodation that is not allowed on statewide standardized testing. For example, there may be parts of a statewide standard, the LEAP test, which measure reading comprehension. On any part measuring reading comprehension, test read aloud cannot be an accommodation for your child. All other parts of the test may be read aloud, just not the part measuring reading comprehension. Now, once the IAP or IEP team determines which accommodations are to be provided, it's the responsibility of the school personnel to provide those accommodations and to document the provision and effectiveness of those accommodations. You should ask the team during the meeting how the provision of and effectiveness of these accommodations will be documented and how that documentation will be shared with you. This could include charts, graphs, sign-in sheets, whatever, as well as a timeline monthly. And you can ask them, how will you do this? And they could say charts, graphs, whatever. But then how often will you do this? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? Is it quarterly? Y'all come to a determination that works for y'all, on which you can expect to get this documentation. Also, only appropriate accommodations and supports are to be included on the IAP or IEP. No related services, such as speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy, etc., are to be included if the student isn't eligible to receive those services. So if the student doesn't qualify for speech services, speech cannot be listed on the IAP, and it can't be listed on IEP either if they're not eligible for those services. All right, let's talk about reevaluation processes for 1508 and special ed and 504. Once the initial special ed evaluation is completed, a reevaluation must be conducted at least every 3 years. Remember, you have to have at least one IEP meeting a year. Now they're saying the reevaluation must be conducted every 3 years. If you or the school determine that one is needed before the 3 years are up, an IEP meeting should be convened to discuss the concerns and determine whether or not a reevaluation should be conducted prior to the 3-year anniversary date. It should be noted, however, that the school system does not have to agree to a reevaluation until at least 1 full year has passed since the completion of the most recent evaluation. Now, what should that reevaluation look like? It should look a lot like the initial evaluation. The evaluation team should consist of the necessary members and disciplines so that the areas of concern are all able to be addressed. New assessment information should be obtained. When it's time for reevaluation comes up, you might be asked to sign a waiver. My recommendation is that you never do this. Always expect that a full reevaluation will be conducted. Some districts do the waiver in a way that is conducive to reliable and current results. They review a lot of data that have been obtained since the last evaluation was done, including work samples, etc. However, there are some districts who will just, for the most part, use the same data from 3 years before that was available when they did the most recent evaluation, and that's not going to provide any current information, which will help to revise the IEP in order to attain better results for the student. If a school district is allowed to do a waiver evaluation and they do it the quick way, by the time it's time for yet another evaluation, then the data with all of the instructional decisions are being made are in effect 6 years old. So if your child is evaluated in 2nd grade and you grant a waiver for the reevaluation due when she's in 5th grade, by the time her reevaluation is due when she gets to 8th grade, your 8th grader's IEP has accommodations and supports based on the child's data in 2nd grade. And I've seen this happen. You want current data and you want to see the data. You know, it's one thing for them to tell you the child that scored this on STAR, scored this on LEAP. Let them show you the reports that show that that's what they've scored. You won't see the test, you won't see the instruments, but you can certainly see the printout of the reports. LEAP has printouts for every student on every test. STAR has printouts for every student on every activity. And any of those benchmarking programs or those assessment programs should be able to get it. Don't just let them write it on a piece of paper. You want to see it, because if you look at it, you can then say, well, I noticed that from here, like he was here 3 years ago and now he's here, he's gone down. What do you think is the cause for that? And let them tell you what they think is the cause. Or he went up, and you can say he went up, but how is the gap between what he's doing and what his peers without disabilities are doing? Because if that gap is not closing quickly enough, he'll never catch up. So just be aware, you need to see the data. Don't just let them tell you what it is. See the documentation and ask them for this before you go to the meeting. When y'all schedule the meeting, tell them you'd like to see this. That way they have it. Otherwise, when you ask for it at the meeting, they might have to set up another meeting, and that's not going to be efficient for you, for the school, and certainly not for the child, because it just is another delay. So, as we talked about, while the evaluation process for Section 504 is much less structured than the evaluation process for special education, everything else is the same. A Section 504 reevaluation should take place at least every 3 years, should include the administration of new assessments, and should include academic, attendance, behavioral, and social data that is current. A Section 504 reevaluation conducted properly is important for the same reasons we discussed for the special education evaluations. Parent rights information is required to be provided to the parents at least once per school year. This is true whether your child is eligible for special education or 504 services. It's important that the school provides these rights at least annually because it is the law. But it is important to you because if you experience any kinds of problems, you will always have a current copy of your rights to which you may refer. These are the rights that parents have under IDEA. You have a right to see your child's school records. You have a right to ask that your child be reevaluated. You have a right to request an independent education evaluation, EE, at no cost to you for any time the school system evaluates your child. You have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in all IEP meetings and decisions. You have the right to seek mediation. You have the right to request a hearing. You have a right to get regular reports of your child's progress, and you have the right to be informed of the rights afforded you under IDEA. And these rights have to be given to you at least once a year. And the State Department does have a handout with these rights on it. Now, when I was special ed director in Lafourche, we would try to give it at every meeting, every IEP meeting. So that way we wouldn't get caught where we didn't give you one, at least the one a year that we're required to do it. Because if you only have one IEP meeting a year, we give it to you. But if you have 6 during that course of the year, for whatever reason, you probably have 6 copies. Now, your rights under 504 are similar, but there are a little bit of differences. You have a right to see your child's school records, to ask that your child be reevaluated, to have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in all 504 meetings and decisions, to request a due process hearing, to get regular reports of your child's progress, and to be notified of your rights under Section 504. Now, if you have IDEA, you do not have the right. Let me see what this is. Under 504, you do not have the right to get an independent education evaluation. And I believe that's about it. That's the main difference. Okay. Okay. So the big question is, what does 504 and 1508 fix? Principals and teachers used to ask me this all the time, and they were surprised at my answer when they would ask me sarcastically, because a lot of times principals, and I'm not faulting them, but principals and teachers sometimes get frustrated with all the rules and the laws that are associated with special ed in 504 to ensure that everyone has equal access. So they'll ask me, they get all aggravated because it's a lot of work, and it is a lot of work. They say, who does 504 fix? Or who does special ed fix? Well, the reason they were surprised when they would ask me that is because my answer would always be nobody. Then I'd pause and continue after a few seconds with, because students who are eligible for 504 and for special ed are not broken. Then when I go to explain that the purpose of 504 is merely to level the playing field through accommodations, extra supports, and services, many of them would tread the dark waters of, well, that's not fair. And just for the record, I hate the statement in all contexts of that's not fair. I did not let my children say that, because life is not fair. And anybody that tells you it's supposed to be fair, they're lying to you, because life is just life. So I would say, let's talk about fair. I would think that children in a wheelchair might think it isn't fair that they can't walk. The child who struggles just to be able to read letters and numbers might think it's not fair that they can't read as well as their friends and peers. And you know what? That's not fair. 504 provides teachers and administrators the ability to level the playing field so that a child's disability doesn't inhibit his or her ability, to a point that opportunities for a child with a disability are fewer than those with a child without a disability. And it is unfair that a child in a wheelchair, is it unfair that a child in a wheelchair uses an elevator to get to the second floor? Obviously not. So why is it unfair for a student who struggles to read to get extended time to complete assignments? The short answer is, it is not. I also have to explain to some of the really stubborn ones that we don't all have to agree with the law, but we do all have to follow the law. And we must also remember that none of this is about what is fair. It is about what is legal. Now, the April-Dunn Act in 2014, it was passed by the Louisiana legislature. It was called Act 833 at the time, and has since been renamed April-Dunn Act. This act allows certain students with disabilities to earn a high school diploma, whereas before they weren't able to. The IEP team discusses the student's needs and determines how the student can meet the graduation requirements. The standards aren't changed, but the way that the student demonstrates mastery of the required standards can be very different for the Act 833 student or the April-Dunn student than it is for those students who do not meet the requirements set forth with the Act. The important thing about the April-Dunn Act, it only applies to students who are receiving special education services. It does not apply to students who are eligible under Section 504. All right, so which is better? We talked about the benefits of 504, the benefits of 1508, the eligibility determination of each, accommodations, the disability conditions, and all that stuff. So the question that we ask is, which one is better? Well, the short answer to the question of which is better, neither. They are different and apply to different students with differing levels of need. I do have one suggestion, however, and I say this to everybody, and again, I'm saying when I was special ed director, I was special ed director for quite some time. And people didn't always like this when I said this. Parents, I always advise parents, while neither special education nor 504 is better than the other, the special education evaluation process, in my opinion, is more thorough because it has to be by law. Also, by law, the evaluation process for Section 504 eligibility can't be as structured as the process used for special education. So I always suggest to parents, initially, when you have concerns and want an evaluation, be very specific that you want your child evaluated for special education, regardless of your concerns. The reason I say this is that a wide array of assessments will be administered by professionals who are trained in assessment practices. More data will be collected, and that will provide more data to the school when trying to determine FAPE. Worst case scenario, your child won't be eligible for special education services, but might be eligible for Section 504 services. If he or she is eligible for 504 services, the 504 team will have much more in-depth data to use when making a plan to assist your child, because they won't have to give another evaluation. They're going to use a special ed eval. And even if your child isn't eligible for either, there will be recommendations within the evaluation report, the special ed evaluation report, which will assist the general education teacher in addressing your concerns in the classroom. It's win, win, win. Okay, having trouble. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a disclaimer. I meant to do it at the beginning and I did not, but I did. I am not a lawyer. So please know that nothing presented today is intended as legal advice. Any questions that I may answer, or if there are any questions at the end, any questions that I may answer, it's just my best estimate based on my experiences and based on what I think might happen based on what knowledge I have of the law. So at this time, do we have any questions?
I'm not
Wallace, do
seeing
we?
any questions in it at this time, but I do have, there's some comments to some stuff that was said earlier in the chat. It was talking when you were talking about the stress level or whatever of the child in the evaluation. And at some point they said, "Wow, thank you, doctor. We need to emphasize to parents that PTSD is real."
And it is. And look, kids don't always know, adults don't know how to process trauma. And trauma can come in many different forms. But kids have even fewer experiences and fewer strategies in their repertoire to be able to deal with stress. They may not even know what stress is. They're just feeling it. And I think what I was talking about mostly was with the parents in those IEP meetings. They are brutal for parents because you feel like you're coming in, you're outnumbered. You feel like you don't know everything you need to know. And look, I'm a parent of 2 children with disabilities, so I'm not saying this is not critical. It's just a reality that it was for me. You feel like you're failing your child because you don't know enough. Now, I will tell you, my son is 44 years old now, but when he was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy, at that point, my wife and I had a discussion, and I did tell her, use these words: we're going to need to fight the system to get what he needs. I think it's easier to fight the system from within than from without. That's when I became a special ed teacher. My son's diagnosis changed my career path completely. And so it's been able to help me. But I remember what it was like to walk into those meetings, and I would either be feeling like I don't understand what they're saying, and this is even when I was a teacher, or I'm furious because you said what you said. I had a principal tell me one time he didn't know why kids like mine had to be in his school. Let me just tell you, that did not go over well with me. So I make it a point to remember what it felt like back then. And I try hard. I'm not always successful, but I try hard when I was special ed teacher and when I was special ed director, never to have somebody else feel that way and not have people have to fight the same battles I fought for my child and won. I don't want people fighting the same battle over and over again. And that is the more complicated situation than you might think. Because when my son was in school and he was getting to school 30 minutes late, leaving 30 minutes early for his own safety, it took me over a year to get that fixed. And when I became a special ed director 17, 18 years ago, they were doing the same thing in the same district that my child went to. So, you can't stop fighting because you don't know what's going to happen. And it keeps you in a constant state of stress. Having a child with a disability is stressful in and of itself. Trying to meet their needs and making sure that they have access to all the things that they need to be able to have a level playing field and a fair shot in life. That's even more stressful than just having the child. Because I don't know about you, but as a human being, I never felt like, I frequently felt like I wasn't stepping up to the plate as much as I should, because I just didn't know better. So yeah, stress is real for the kid and for the adult.
And then the other comment was when you were talking about the school days, it was emphasized the school days, for the evaluation process. And they were going, you're not meaning calendar days. And that's correct. Calendar days are different from school days. And I'm
Days are
glad
different
you
than
brought
school
that
days.
out.
Yeah. Calendar days are different than school days. Business days are different than school days. So different laws go for different things, because a business day would include the summer because the school district is open. A school day is when the kids actually go. It does not include professional development days for teachers. It's days that the kids actually go. And calendar days count Saturdays, Sundays, holidays, and all. So depending on the law that's being addressed, whether it's in Special Ed 504 or any other legal issue in the school system, they typically will specify that it's a calendar day or a business day or a school day. If it does not specify and you cannot get clarification, my practice was to assume that it was calendar day, which is the shortest period of time.
And then there's a comment. It's always so good. Thank you, Dr. Miss you. And that's somebody, so that's good. Thank you for the good comment. And then here's a question. How can family deal with accommodation at home daily?
Say that again.
How can family deal with accommodation at home daily?
Am I hearing? How can the family deal with accommodations daily at home?
Correct.
Okay. Well, and again, it's going to depend on what the accommodation is. If, let's say, it's your child has extended time at school, well, you might want to give them extended time at home. But I'm going to tell you too, extended time and I'm going to use this as a specific example so that you can see maybe an easier way. Extended time is a double-edged sword, because if my child gets 2 days to do an assignment, but your child gets 3 days, well, okay, that's fine. But in those 3 days, there's another assignment haven't gotten. So now he's behind everybody. So he just snowballs, and it adds stress to that child. But if you can instead determine a way with the school to get shortened assignments, then that will give you the same amount of time to do a shortened assignment. So it has the same impact, and as long as the teacher is really good about determining how to shorten it properly so the child doesn't miss any instructional. And the reason I give that specific example is because I personally think there's too much homework given at school, and frequently it is not meaningful homework. So if you can get shortened assignments, then that will also give them a less work to do at school. They have shortened homework assignments, and it gives them less work to do at school. I think it is just as important for your child to go outside and play, get on a game box or whatever it is that they're doing for a few minutes, not forever. Watch a TV show, play with their friends, do whatever the things that kids need to do. I think it's more important for them to do that than to stay at home for 4 hours doing homework after they've been in school for 6 hours, while the child is having a tantrum and you're about to pull what's left of your hair out. I had hair when my kids were young, and this is what happens. So yeah, it's hard to do because sometimes you can't do it. But what I would suggest when you have an accommodation at school, talk with the teacher and see how that can translate into your home life. But I think if you could make it where it's better for the child in both settings, it makes it better for the teacher and for the child. And listen, if you do it, since I'm on shortened assignments, if you can do shortened assignments, make sure that they shorten it, but they don't shorten the content. They might have, like, for example, math. Math is my pet peeve with homework, because do page 127, odd numbers 1 to 51. And so you go through what they got. You got 26 problems there. Okay, that's too much homework. If there's 2 or 3 different skills in those 26 problems, that's fine. But just give them 2 of each of the skills. So they might have 6 problems instead. And the reason they give the odd numbers is because typically the even numbers are in the back of the book. They have the answers. All right. So give them the even numbers, give them only 2 or maybe 3 of each skill. And that way they can look in the back of the book after they work the problem, because they have to show their work. And the answers on the back of the book are just the answers. If they don't have the right answer, then they have to figure out how it's wrong. That's valuable homework. If they have the right answer, why do they need to do 12 more? So, kind of go with that. See if you can, and ask the teacher, how can this work at home? Because there's so many different accommodations. It could be a break here and there, but just, talk with the teacher in the IEP meeting, because they do have to consider parental concerns, and homework is definitely a concern.
And here's another question. So a 504 plan does not have to have an official diagnosis from a medical professional in order to receive services. So that's a question.
Typically, they don't have to. It makes it much easier if they do. There needs to be something, because you have to have something to support that there is a disability. I'm trying to think, like, for example, if your child has ADHD, you can't just say your child has ADHD. There needs to be some evidence of that ADHD. Now, I could argue that if your child is on medication for ADHD prescribed by a physician for that purpose, I could argue that perhaps that would be sufficient. But if you already have the prescription, it shouldn't be much of a big deal for you to be able to call the doctor and get him to write a note that says he has ADHD. It doesn't have to be a drawn-out evaluation, because the school's going to take whatever you give them, if it's a note from the doctor, if it's the prescription, and they're going to do the evaluation. And remember, a 504 evaluation is much less structured. And another disadvantage with the 504 evaluation, the tests are not as rigorous, but the people that are administering the test are frequently not as trained as in a special ed evaluation. They have more rigorous assessments, and the people are trained, and they typically have master's degrees for 504 for special ed, not so in 504. But I think you could get away with it without, but it would be hard to argue if the school said, no, you don't have a doctor's diagnosis, so we can't consider you. I think that would be wrong, but I don't necessarily think you could I don't necessarily you could come out on top in an argument, in a protest.
Okay, and then it says, besides speech therapy, are there other accommodations for kids who do not communicate well? Caregiver was told that they don't qualify to learn sign language because their child is not hearing impaired. Can they qualify for a communication device or something else while at school?
The fact that the child is not hearing impaired should not take off the table sign languaging. If he can't speak, sign language is another way for him to communicate. So I would say that in the IEP process, that would be something that you could argue for, explain what the outcome is. Also, there are all kinds of good apps on iPhones and iPads and all, especially iPads and iPhones, with for communication devices, a picture, I can't remember, picture, I forget what they call it, but it's communication issues. And so they have all kinds of stuff so that your child can find something on the iPad or the iPhone and then show it to the other person. And yes, would he qualify for that? He should be able to, because if he can't speak, this is another way for him to speak. So either and I don't see any harm with teaching somebody sign language. I would ask, why can't he get sign language? And if it's because they don't have anybody trained in that, that's not a reason. That's just not a reason. But the app is a really good solution. And here's the thing that's so different now than it was like when my child was younger. Now, my child doesn't have any communication issues. But when my child was younger, if you gave him a Dynavox, let's say, and it looked like a big old jam box, it was huge. It looked like there was something wrong with you. But now everybody carries an iPhone or an iPad. So you can do that, and it doesn't single your child out as somebody who has a special condition, special need. So it's much easier now in that respect of technology for your child to be able to do it and just fly under the radar. But yes, those things should be absolutely discussed in an IEP meeting, and should be when they give you that notice of prior intent. And notice of prior intent is a notice they're telling you what they will do or won't do prior to them actually doing it or not doing it. It happens after the meeting, but it's before the implementation. So definitely make sure that they include that. And you also want to include this very concern in your parental concerns. That should be documented on the IEP for sure. Because you want to have it documented so that if ever somebody determines that it was appropriate, then you can go back and say, I've been trying to get this for a year and a half, that kind of thing.
Then we got some comments saying that this is an excellent presentation. And then another question, does this calculation include prior written notice action 2? So I'm not sure what they're referring to.
Yeah, me neither. Read it again.
Does this calculation include prior written notice action 2? If you could clarify some in the chat what you're referring to, that would help us to maybe answer your question. Or if you want me to allow you to talk, I can do that too. Okay, it says the count of days for prior written notice.
The calculation of days for prior written notice.
Yeah, that maybe they're meaning the count of days, and they say yes.
Yeah, for the prior written notice, I don't think it's actually stipulated specifically. I think it says it's within a reasonable period of time. Typically, that reasonable period of time would be 5 to 10 days. So, but remember that it needs to be before the IEP is implemented. So if they're going to implement it in 10 days, then they would have those 10 days to be able to get you that information.
And then here's another question. How does a child qualify for extended summer school?
There's 2 ways that a child can qualify for extended summer school, and they will do that. It's regression recoupment is one of them. And that's like if the child over a break, they would monitor him after several breaks. And if the child loses ground and it takes longer than anticipated to catch up the skills that he lost during that short break, that's one way that they can qualify. And there's a second way, and I don't remember what it's called, but if I never was really involved with summer school. I had people that did that, so forgive me. But if they feel like because of the nature of the disability, if too much time off is going to cause too much regression that the child wouldn't be able to accommodate, recover from, they will let them go just to maintain the growth. I don't remember all the specific terms and all, but there are 2 ways. And you have the right to ask if they say he's not eligible, ask for the data that shows it and have them explain it to you. And what's the method that you use to determine this? And what if these are the data you're showing me, what would it look like if he did qualify? Like, what would the data need to look like if he did qualify? She can ask that. But not a lot of kids with the requirements of summer extended school year. Not a lot of kids are being eligible right now. I've noticed that in the last several years, a lot less have been eligible for it.
And I apologize. I was reading the chat, so you may have said this, and I'm not sure. So, did you mention the other one was extenuating circumstances?
Or what?
For the extended school year. That's another reason why they can get it, for extenuating circumstances. No special reason.
I would imagine that there would be a way with extenuating circumstances, but I would caution, because extenuating circumstances would not mean, for example, if you have trouble getting childcare during the summer, that would not be extenuating circumstances. There would have to be something, for example, let's say extenuating circumstances, I think would probably would work for this. Let's say your child's scheduled for scoliosis surgery in August, and your child is going to be recovering from that surgery for 8 weeks at the beginning of the school year, they would consider an extenuating circumstance to keep him going, because otherwise you're out for basically 4 months. So that might be something that they would be able. I mean, that is something as a special ed director that I would entertain a discussion on that easily.
Right. So there's regression recruitment is one, and extenuating circumstances is the second.
I don't know if extenuating circumstances is what they actually call it. I honestly, I just don't remember.
Yeah, I believe that.
So
Yeah, I think
there's actually 3 of them. There's regression recruitment, critical point of instruction, and extenuating circumstances.
Critical point of instruction I couldn't think of. Thanks, Melinda.
Y'all are welcome.
well, that's what it takes a team to do this, because
That's right. That's right.
I was reading the chat and I missed it. I wasn't sure if you said it. So yeah, thank you, Melinda, for adding that in. Oh, Naz, can you repeat that again? The 3?
Regression recoupment, critical points of instruction, and extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, and again, there's parents saying this, or professionals both, saying this is an awesome presentation, and thank you very much for this presentation. So we're grateful for it all.
Well, and I'm going to end it by saying this. Please, you may or may not know this, but the Attorney General of Louisiana, along with 12 or 13 other states in the United States, the Attorney Generals of those states have filed a brief or something with the Supreme Court to have Section 504 deemed unconstitutional. So if you are in favor of that or against it, I'm not advocating one way or the other, but if you have an opinion about whether or not 504 is beneficial or if it's detrimental, whatever it is, please write to your Attorney General, because she has included Louisiana in the movement to try to have 504 eradicated. I don't have any idea what that will look like. So if it were to happen, but be aware that this is happening, and Louisiana is one of the states that's engaged in it. So where are you, again, whether you support that move or you are opposed to it, write to the Louisiana Attorney General and write to your senators and representatives, so that at least they know that something's happening and what your thoughts are on that. Okay. And Wallace and Melinda, I want to thank y'all for your help with this. Melinda, I couldn't have got through that extended school year thing without you. I appreciate it. And if y'all have any questions about anything educationally, please contact Wallace. If you have any questions about any legislative functions that are going through right now with the LACAN, Melinda is always ready to help out with that, because she's very active and goes to the legislature whenever she can. So we are an active. This is going to be a busy time for Melinda, especially. And as school is winding down, it's going to be busy for you, parents of children with disabilities. So don't hesitate to get help if you need it. There's no shame in asking for help. So, and that's what we're here for. Okay. Y'all have a great day. I appreciate your patience, and I love the questions. Thank you so much.
And again, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Charlie Marshall, for giving us a valuable presentation. I put the link to their evaluation in the chat box. I also will follow it up in an email along with the PowerPoint from this presentation. So we thank you for all the questions and the feedback that you've given us. And please complete the evaluation survey if you haven't done it already. And thank you again, everyone, for attending. Have a great day.
Thanks, Wallace. See you later.